Hi, Hannah.
Hi, Sam.
How's it going?
A little sleepy, very happy.
Yeah. We are recording this just after New Year's, after having some fun upstate New York with some friends.
Yeah. Happy to be home with the cat, but was also happy to be up there with the hot tub.
So it's the new year, and we're going to be talking about a book that we read last year, though. For me, I finished this book right before I went to Japan, so about a month ago. And for you...
I think I read it like in September, so I'm less fresh. And I also didn't take notes on it because I read this book and I loved it, and then I asked you to read it. So when I was reading it, I was not thinking about the podcast at all. So you're going to kind of be leading the charge today.
Yeah. But wait, what book are we reading?
Oh my God, we're talking about Too Late to Die Young by Harriet McBryde Johnson.
Yes. Who is Harriet McBryde Johnson?
Harriet McBryde Johnson passed away a few years ago, unfortunately. She was a disability rights lawyer. She was a...
Southern genteel...
Yeah, I'm just
beau.
a simple Southern lawyer. Southern charm, lots of Southern charm, lots of very radical politics to do with the essential humanity of disabled people. I think probably it's accurate to say by extension, the human rights of all people to have their basic needs met. Harriet McBryde Johnson had muscular dystrophy. She was in college when Reagan was in office, so she would have been born in the 50s or 60s. And so she was part of the first generation of kids with muscular dystrophy to live into and then well into adulthood because of the advent of improved antibiotics. She was a committed atheist. She was a human rights lawyer. She was a lifelong Democrat. She was an activist with Not Dead Yet and other disability rights groups. And she was a great storyteller. This memoir is fantastic. I read also her young adult book called Crip Camp about a summer camp that seemed to be kind of modeled after a camp that she went to when she was a kid. She's one of those people who's just like so talented. She could have had about 20 careers, but I would say the disciplines that she committed herself to most were law and writing. And this book was such a joy to read.
Yeah. It's kind of like a memoir of hers. The subtitle for the book is Nearly True Stories from a Life.
I feel like that subtitle, From a Life, is carrying so much weight because the first thing that we hear in this book is that some of her earliest memories as a child was becoming aware of her own mortality. And that she, in fact, became aware of her own mortality before she became aware of anyone else's mortality, because there was so much forceful messaging around her about muscular dystrophy leading to early death. And so as a young child, thought of herself as uniquely doomed, didn't understand yet that her non-disabled parents and sister and other loved ones would also die. And even as she started to understand mortality as a more universal thing, she didn't yet know that she would live to an advanced age. Every year was an unexpected gift. Not that she would have phrased it that way because she doesn't believe in a creator who's gifting her years of life. And she's, again, very clear about that in the book. But she frames the first chapter by going through the different stages of her life. If I'm gonna live to age 18, I might as well live as a student. Or if I'm going to die, I might as well die a lawyer. And so it's like a really unique relationship with mortality that I think shaped her personality and worldview. And it's funny that such an expansive and charming and sometimes a little bit flowery of a storyteller can be also so bracingly blunt. This book just absolutely grabs you with that.
Yeah. And I think another important thing to point out there is that, or at least my impression was not that she was an atheist out of some sort of contempt for the world.
No. She loves the world.
Yeah, because I think there's that perception of atheists as somewhat pessimistic, and of course I think that speaks a lot more about American culture generally. But I think it's really important to point out that her atheism comes more out of her way of thinking about the world.
Well, she doesn't get into it much, does she?
No, but I think as you read through her life experiences, it's very clear that she was meant to be a lawyer in the way that she thinks about things very logically and precise, while at the same time recognizing that facts are limited to our perception of the world.
Yeah, I mentioned her atheism because I think, like, after reading this book, if you say, who was Harriet McBryde Johnson? And I want to describe her on the terms that she would describe herself, I would say Harriet McBryde Johnson was a human rights advocate. She had radical politics centering disability. She was an activist, she was a storyteller, and she was an atheist. And I think those are, like, the most salient things about herself. And she was a Southerner. I think those are all the things that it seems that she wanted to convey about herself in this book.
Yeah, and the book is 11 chapters. I think the first chapter is kind of just an overview of maybe why she wrote the book or of her general perspective on life. And then the remaining are basically 10 different experiences that she had throughout life and her reflection on it, both through the lens of disability, but also just through, again, all the different worldviews or perspectives that she held as a person, as an atheist or as a disability rights lawyer or as a radical leftist who grew up in Charleston, South Carolina.
Oh, and who loved it.
And who loved
The
it.
way that she writes about Charleston, like, makes you want to go there.
Right.
The way she writes about, like, the trees and the sidewalks and the way that people interact with each other, it just sounds like so beautiful. Let's go to Charleston.
Yeah.
I mean, not, now.
Yeah. So I highlighted some of the things in the book that I found most thought-provoking in terms of her sharing her perspective. So let's get into it. And I'm mostly just going to read what she wrote because she writes it much better than I could ever try to summarize it. This first one comes from a story of hers. If you're reading along or you have read the book, this comes from chapter 8, which is entitled Getting Thrown. And generally the chapter is about her experience being out of state, suffering an injury, falling out of her wheelchair, and then having to get medical care out of state.
A lot of the disability rights movement, and therefore a lot of her career, is focused on deinstitutionalization. So there's two ways that people will talk about disability in regard to people. And one of them is known as person first language. You've probably heard a lot. Like, you wouldn't say a disabled person, you would say a person with disabilities. You wouldn't say an autistic person, you would say a person with autism. And the thought there is that people are fundamentally defined by their humanity and that the disability is something that they have or experience and it doesn't define them. And then the other preference, I guess, is identity first language. And that is where you would say, I'm a disabled person, I'm an autistic person, I'm a blind person, I'm a deaf person. And that stems from the belief that disability would be an adjective just like any other adjective, that it's neither good or bad, and it is intrinsic to our life experiences. I prefer identity first language. I describe myself as a disabled person. I wouldn't say I'm a person with brunetteness or a person with Jewishness or a person with womanhood. So it makes the most sense to me. I don't think that there's anything morally wrong with identity first language, especially if it's coming from people who live with disabilities. And I certainly wouldn't tell them that their feelings about how they would prefer to themselves and be referred to are wrong. But there isn't one, like, gold standard practice, and I am just going to use the one that I use. So that's that spiel. So Harriet McBryde Johnson fought hard against deinstitutionalization. Then that is, like, part of disability rights is making sure that disabled people are not trapped in nursing homes and that instead have as much as possible home care and the highest degree of independence and the highest degree of being able to be out in the community interacting with people and working and doing stuff. And what happens a lot, because it's the most cost effective in the short term, is that disabled people end up in nursing homes where they have very little autonomy. And her big, big, big fear in this chapter about taking the fall was that she would end up incarcerated in a nursing home. And because of that, she's very resistant to seeking medical attention. And I just found that very eye-opening because, if I, like, break my arm, break my ankle, whatever, I'm sure that would be a terrifying experience, but I wouldn't be afraid that my life as I know it would end.
And this is also, like, I think a comparison of the treatment that she received out of state compared to what she's used to receiving in state, in her home of Charleston. So this comes directly from the book. I'll just read it. Quote, "This is something I've never encountered in a hospital. Professional solicitude and respect. Other than my longtime primary care doctor, never has a medical provider acknowledged my responsibilities. In past hospitalizations, I've dealt with people who refer to my law practice in the past tense, give me Medicaid paperwork after I've presented my bar insurance card, show by every word and deed that they see my occupation as disabled and my life as nearing its end, and none too soon. They charge in to toss this or that piece of me here or there, denying my dominion over my body. Here, it's, we'd like to take your blood pressure. Can I get your arm here and lift it up? End quote. So as a healthcare provider myself, this passage really spoke to me. And this, I think, is reflective of not just someone who is a healthcare worker working with a disabled person, but a healthcare worker working with anyone, really, is how do we as healthcare providers treat the people that we're working with? And I'll be honest, I sometimes have trouble with the language patient or with the use of the term patient because I feel like it creates this somewhat hierarchical distinction between the healthcare provider and the quote unquote patient. And I think there is this overwhelmingly large perspective among healthcare workers that they know what's best.
Yeah.
And not that it's black and white, but that generally they just know better what is best for the people that they're trying to help and not really taking into consideration how the person being treated feels about that. I feel like this was just a great example of how, in one of the times of her most vulnerable experiences, how much of a godsend, no pun intended, it was to have caring and empathetic healthcare providers.
Tell me about your relationship with bedside manner. I guess I'm thinking in particular of when you administer vaccines.
Oh, yeah.
I remember asking you about that early on after we started dating. I was curious about how you dealt with administering vaccines, especially to kids when they're scared. And I guess, hearing you talk about this book now, I'm curious about how you started with bedside manner, approaching this goal of humanizing the patient and keeping them on the same level as you power-wise, and how that's evolved over your career so far.
I think, honestly, my quote-unquote bedside manner is probably more informed by my history or by my past as a martial arts instructor working with kids and adults. There was a big emphasis in my leadership training on distinguishing between the times when, as a leader, you have to step up and lead, take charge of the situation, and progress it forward at times when maybe the people that you're leading aren't able to. Distinguishing between that and being a leader that always knows best or sees themselves as the end-all be-all of the situation.
The ultimate authority.
The ultimate authority in ways that I don't even think necessarily the training itself realized. It was kind of emphasized on me how much of a partnership teaching is. And so naturally for me, it kind of rolled over into healthcare, that healthcare is not about me, the authority, coming down to take care of the sick person, but me providing my knowledge to help lead and guide the person who is there for treatment.
Yeah, it's kind of like you're the expert in pharmaceutical knowledge and they're the expert in their own body and their own health.
Right.
And you're collaborating.
Right.
And what has it been like for you to work as a medical provider with disabled people? Is it different from working with non-disabled people?
I would say the difference is more structural, maybe, in the sense that our built structures are built with non-disabled people in mind first, most often. So I guess the thing I'm thinking about most is like getting into the vaccination area. For me personally, I always try to make it as accommodating as possible, specifically regarding vaccines or the process of getting a vaccine done in a retail pharmacy. Having worked in not just for a number of years, but also in so many different locations, there's a set procedure to be followed, but there is not a set setting for vaccinations. I've given vaccines with people sitting in aisles in chairs, and I've given vaccines in separated rooms that are private and everything in between. So in that sense, I think it very much does make a difference for a disabled person if they've got to maneuver around lines of people waiting for prescriptions to get to the vaccination area. And it's kind of in plain sight of everyone else, or maybe they can't get to the vaccination area because it's behind a curtain because it's not big enough to accommodate a wheelchair, and therefore they just have to get their vaccination in the sight of the public, which
I remember like getting in particular my COVID vaccinations, especially the early ones that were like pretty rough. I have Erb's palsy, which is paralysis affecting my left arm. So my left shoulder, arm, wrist, hand, fingers, all nerve damaged. So limited use of that portion of my body. And so I always get vaccines in my right arm because of the way that sensation works in that area in my left arm would make it unpleasant experience. And I knew that the COVID vaccine was going to make my arm really sore and I would have trouble lifting it. And, convincing them to do it on the right side because I didn't want to go through that on the left. And then kind of dealing with the next couple of days of having limited use of my right arm. It was like a moment when I felt my disability interacting with this novel experience. Yeah, I think like disability is such a fluid thing. Novel processes tend to be more disabling than your own routines. Because your own routines, you already know how to do them, and they're routines, right? I know how to cook and dress myself and shop and take the subway and, get from here to there. And any accommodations that I need, they're already built into my life. But when I start to try to do something new, like get a new, very important, very good vaccine that will protect myself and everyone around me, it ends up becoming disabling because I have not yet figured out what those accommodations are.
To a certain extent, I guess that is something that is navigated by everyone getting a vaccination in the sense that, like, it's not part of their routine. But because you're adding that on top of your routine, which already has to navigate a world that is often not accommodating for disabled people, that adds an extra layer of complexity to it.
Something I've noticed at the pharmacy is that the counter is quite high. How do you work with wheelchair users as a retail pharmacist?
When you say the counter is high, you're talking about the checkout counter?
The counter you go up to be like, I'm here to pick up my meds. Do people have trouble reaching it?
Sometimes, yeah. And I think also the nature of retail pharmacy, the majority of our population is over 65. So I would say generally most retail pharmacy workers are used to assisting people with either reading the prompts on the screen or helping them, maybe having to speak a little louder or a little bit more slowly to help them understand if they're hard of hearing. So in terms of accommodations, in that instance, if someone's not able to reach a screen or something, the person working would generally, I think, go around the counter and help them out.
Which is cool, but it really, like, now that I'm thinking about it, it really kind of seems like there could just be a lower part of the counter. As you were reading that passage, I was reminded of, over the past few months, I went through several levels of screening for breast cancer. I don't have breast cancer.
Yay!
But for the first time in my life, I had to go get a mammogram because I'm only 34 and before, I think, age 40, that's not a routine screening. That's something that you get done if they find something that they're worried about. And so I went and got a mammogram. And if you've gotten a mammogram, you know that you just stand really awkwardly. It's a very awkward, very funny procedure. And because of my arm, it was challenging for me. And it was challenging for the technicians who were working with me. You're really supposed to lift your arm up above your head when you're being squished in the big squisher machine. And I can't do that. My arm does not go above my head unassisted. And even if it is being assisted, it doesn't go that high up. And so we had to work together. Actually, yeah, just like you and I were just saying, we had to work collaboratively to get the images that they needed. You know, it was a long day. I kept on like leaving, coming back in, leaving, coming back in. But as I told you afterwards, the thing that I was the most upset about was I need to get back to the office and file this story before the deadline. Otherwise, I'm going to have to cancel my evening plans, right? And like I've had other experiences in healthcare settings where like something like that would have been traumatic because I have been made to feel sometimes like the fact that my disability is an obstacle for their machinery or for their procedure is something that I should feel guilty about, that I'm being burdensome and problematic and just difficult. And, you know, eye rolling, scoffing, clear frustration. Instead, these technicians were brisk, they were competent, they were efficient. But the underlying attitude that came across to me that day was, I'm so sorry, this is such a pain in your ass. Thank you for being so patient. Coming from them. Like I was doing them a big favor. And also, as she said in the passage, may I lift your arm? Can you hold it this way? Can you hold this position for 10 more seconds? Always asking consent before touching me, asking me how my body worked, telling me what outcome that they needed, and then getting my say in how to achieve that outcome. And again, just like the attitude of, we're so sorry about this, you're being a champ, as opposed to, why would you do this to me? It's so annoying that you came in here disabled. It was very inconsiderate of you. Made it overall an annoying and tiring day and not an upsetting day.
And I think if you asked healthcare workers, 95% of them would agree that none of this is your fault. Obviously, there is a prejudice against disabled people. And also, sometimes people let their frustrations about just working generally, especially if they're in healthcare, working short-staffed or under pressure, letting those frustrations that they feel end up coming across to the patient or the person they're working with and making them feel as if, this inconvenience that you're giving me, like in my head, I know it's not you, but I'm still frustrated and I'm still going to show this frustration.
Right, which is one thing when, you're dealing with trying to get your flight changed at the airport or whatever. But when you're a healthcare worker, you're interfacing with someone who's probably going through like an exceptionally vulnerable time. So that's hard. This is really relevant to like the classical definition of emotional labor, right? Like the Arlie Hochschild definition of emotional labor, the feminized labor of like presenting a certain emotion and suppressing your actual emotions for the benefit of the consumer. A strong case can be made that it is much more called for in healthcare roles than in customer service roles. Anyway, shout out to Lenox Hill Radiology. Everyone who works there is an angel. And thanks for finding out I don't have breast cancer.
Yeah. So the next passage that I have is from chapter 10, which is entitled Art Object. And in this chapter, she is recounting her experience getting her picture taken for the New York Times Magazine for an article that she had written. And I'm skipping around in the book. I'm not necessarily going sequential order of the book.
And if you know of Harriet McBryde Johnson already and not from the book, then you probably know of her from the article that she wrote for the New York Times Magazine. Actually, she wrote it for her own blog, and then the New York Times Magazine picked it up. It's called Unspeakable Conversations, and it's about her experience going to Princeton to debate Peter Singer, who is a philosopher mostly known for his animal liberation positions, but who also advocates for selective infanticide of disabled people.
Which is bad.
Which is bad.
In case
anyone was wondering how we feel about selective infanticide of disabled people, we are all the way thumbs down on it.
Yeah.
As was Harriet McBryde Johnson.
The chapter has much more to do with the actual experience of getting the picture taken, but this is regarding the final product. Quote, "The New York Times Magazine cover has been described as beautifully disturbing, and most non-disabled people seem to see it that way. I prefer to call it disturbingly beautiful, but I'd take it the other way around if I must. The disturbing part happens inside people's heads. This unconventional body, draped and lit and posed like a fashion model, apparently floating in space in a power chair, disturbs preconceived notions, makes people question what they think they know. The beautiful part, well, that's me." The reason I highlighted that is because the first thing that comes to my mind when I hear that latter part of that paragraph is, I think it was Victoria's Secret that had...
A disabled model?
Yeah, or maybe even an entire show that was...
yes, I remember this. Yeah, and Victoria's Secret uses a lot of disabled models now, too.
Yeah. I think there at one point there was a backlash against it. The comment saying to the effect of, you're trying to be nice, but this isn't actually beautiful.
Yeah,
kind of
or
thing.
even like you're being exploitative.
Yeah, which I think is, as we've talked about many times on this podcast, I feel like we say this every episode, but where this feeling of disgust or of what's natural comes up in someone's head, and then they see something that challenges that preconceived notion of what should be beautiful and what should be relegated to quote unquote disgusting or awkward or weird, and they have this disconnect with what they're seeing.
Do you remember when Jordan Peterson showed his entire ass on the internet for the umpteenth time It was the cover of Sports Illustrated swimsuit edition, and it was just like a plus-sized model. And he put out some statement about, objectively, she is not beautiful. And everybody was like, Jordan Peterson, your boner is not like an objective measure of objective beauty. Beauty cannot be measured objectively. But this is a man who is so invested in ingrained hierarchies that he's built up an entire philosophical system to, in part, scaffold his own boner's inherent wisdom about what is natural and good and beautiful. And most people are not quite so committed to build their entire career out of these reactionary politics stemming in part from that disgust response. Fuck Jordan Peterson. But you have these experiences, right? And if you know better, then a lot of the time, the best we can do is to catch ourselves in that knee-jerk reaction and think, what am I feeling right now? Like, what's happening? Why is it weird for me to see a person with Down syndrome modeling underwear? Why do I have a problem with that? Do I think that people with Down syndrome don't need underwear? Because they definitely do. Do I think that people with Down syndrome ought not to be sexualized? Because I think most of them would disagree with me quite strongly. You know, they're adults and they have sexual relationships and they experience themselves as sexual beings. So maybe it's some learned infantilization. Maybe it's some learned ideas about what it means to model underwear, that you should be somebody who I should consider a sexual being, somebody who I would want to interact with sexually, or who my peers would. And a good thing to do is to interrogate all of those reactions. And another thing that people do instead of interrogating those reactions, I think a lot of the time, is to come up with an ad hoc justification for why their response of disgust or anxiety or disapproval is justified and morally good.
Yeah. And honestly, I think that's a perfect segue into the next quote of hers, which comes from her final chapter. Quote, "When non-disabled people start learning about disability, what seems most startling, most difficult to accept, is the possibility of pleasure." End quote. Yeah.
Such a beautiful last chapter.
Oh, yeah. The last chapter is her recounting her own experiences with finding a beautiful relationship.
She doesn't share a great deal, but, you know, she alludes to the fact that she has fallen in love. Or I don't know if she's fallen in love. She's started a romance and it might grow to be something really fulfilling and exciting. And in reflecting on pleasure, this is something that stuck with me. She talks about how her body and her abilities have changed over the course of her life and how with the evolution of her, I guess you could term them impairments, how she has found new joys. So she talks about using a power chair to navigate the streets of Charleston, playing a game with herself to see, like, can I navigate all the way to the office with one continuous motion on my lever? And I feel like I've made this point in different forms, in different social settings about like disabled beauty and disabled pleasure. And people are very resistant to it. Non-disabled people, I mean, are very resistant to it. I think because they are very committed to understanding disability as only deficit, only impairment. If not tragedy, then at least something negative to be overcome or counterbalanced.
Right. Which also gets into one of the beginning chapters with her and her fight against the Jerry Lewis telethon.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's this sense that disabled people are meant to be an example, to be pitied, and therefore are not people in and of themselves.
Yeah, the function of disabled people is to be an object of pity, to inspire in non-disabled people gratitude for all the good things that they already have. Mm-hmm. And as I say that out loud, I realize that that's not just objectifying to disabled people, but also that whole dynamic is perfectly engineered to crush radical thought in the non-disabled people, because it's like, you mustn't want anything better for yourself. Look, at least you have legs. Do you know what I mean? I feel like a lot of ableism and disableism works so well with capitalist hierarchies, keeping the poor poor and trying to prevent the poor from agitating for things that would improve their lot in life, like universal health care, strong labor unions, safe and affordable housing, robust public transit. All these things that disabled people need are things that everybody needs or could benefit from.
Right.
And if we're able to push this paradigm of disabled people are objects to be pitied, and look how bad they have it, and you don't have it that bad, so what do you have to complain about?
Yeah, don't rock the boat.
Mm-hmm.
Which was, I feel like, something coming up in a conservative Christian household. There was these compiled instances of pointing to people who were rocking the boat, who were unsatisfied with the status quo,
Mm-hmm.
as somehow deviant or morally wrong for not being happy with what they have.
Mm-hmm.
The moral high ground was to be grateful
Mm-hmm.
and to work.
Yeah, but I feel like that's like a very American ethos too, right? Like,
Yeah.
that agitation to improve the lot for everybody is somehow morally wrong and a symbol of laziness.
Yeah.
The only morally pure work is the work to strive for social mobility for yourself and your immediate family. And somehow the labor that goes into agitating for strong labor laws, for fair compensation, for universal childcare, universal healthcare, great public housing, all of these things, like, that's not morally good labor because it would benefit everybody and not just you.
Yeah, it goes against the individualistic mindset that if you're not doing something that is seeking to make you more money in your life and your immediate loved ones better off, it very much fits in with the capitalist mindset of if you're not bringing value is a very ambiguous word, but I would say that they're talking about ultimately shareholder value, but value in terms of like making money on top of money or, earning interest on money or, building yourself a nest egg, all in terms of money and not really in terms of societal well-being. And it's not that money and societal well-being are diametrically opposed, but in this culture that I grew up in, you are expected to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and therefore people who aren't doing that, who are advocating for changes in policy and the way that society is enacted, yeah, they're being lazy. Or the view is kind of like, if you really want to advocate for yourself, you just need to like become the entrepreneur that enables you to live a comfortable life.
And that individualist ethos carries over to how we think about health. It is not morally good to improve health outcomes by agitating for safe sidewalks so that folks can walk or use their mobility aids to get to and from wherever they need to be. It is not morally good public health practice to agitate for affordable groceries that include fresh produce, public housing that includes full functional kitchens, playgrounds, soccer fields, all of these things that improve public health outcomes, free health screenings. That's not what we think about when we think about wellness and health, right? When we think about wellness and health, we're thinking about discipline, individual discipline, waking up at 4 a.m. and meal prepping for the week, going to the gym that you pay your membership for, in your car that you drive only yourself in. Moralizing of health status goes hand in hand with that individualistic mindset about health. And so bad health outcomes, disabling health outcomes, must be due to moral failure on the part of the disabled person.
Yeah.
And so it is best for disabled people to hush hush, don't complain, and to always be a beautiful, gleaming example of gratitude and sympathy. And when disabled people instead talk about the pleasures of our lives and the strength and the joy and community and in our embodied experience, well, that goes quite against the grain there, doesn't it?
Yeah. And man, I feel like we've just been segueing one quote into another.
Oh,
but
really?
yeah, I feel like this next, and this is the last one I had highlighted, but this comes from the chapter Believing in Dreams, and it's her recounting her experience going to Cuba. And this was
I
in
love
like,
that chapter. That was so
I
cool.
feel like this was in the 90s, right?
Yeah.
So this is post USSR, like Cuba's still a communist country.
And she goes there for a disability conference.
Yes,
Yeah.
she goes with her sister, and she's kind of comparing Cuba to America. And the most interesting thing I found about this chapter was just her talking about Cuba and what it was like in Cuba, because the thing I've been told my whole life, at one point being not 60 miles away from Cuba in Key West, Florida, was that Cuba is this communist hellhole where there's the ruling government on top that takes all the money and everyone else just lives in abject poverty.
Oh, yeah, definitely not.
So this next part I'm going to have Hannah read because there is a
reclaimed slur.
A reclaimed slur that I don't feel comfortable saying, nor is it appropriate really for me to say. So she's going to read this. The only thing I wanted to preface it with was the first part where she's talking about the system. She's talking about Cuba. And then when she goes on to talk about our system, when she says our system, halfway through, she's referring to the American. So she's comparing Cuba to the American system.
The plan reveals a system where well-intentioned experts decide what's best for people with disabilities, as they decide for people without disabilities. There's not much about choice or freedom, but then I ask myself, what does freedom really mean for the average crip in our system? Living hand to mouth in the community or languishing in a nursing home? The average crip is guaranteed liberty and due process, but not healthcare, housing, or a living wage. Knowing how little choice there is at the bottom of the pecking order, I'm impressed by a society where inequality is not accepted as a regrettable fact of life. In Cuba, inequality is intolerable. It's unpatriotic.
I thought that was a great dichotomy to America, where we talk about patriotism all the time, and certainly there is an American brand of patriotism. And I think the political moment we're in is almost this question of, does American patriotism tolerate inequality? And I would say on a large scale, it does.
I would say that standard issue American patriotism requires inequality, right? Because if we valorize social mobility with this bootstraps ideology so much, then inequality is necessary.
A guaranteed outcome.
A guaranteed outcome, and the best you can get within that framework is lifting up the floor, which, hell, I'll take it, but it's a completely different paradigm than the one that she introduces in that chapter about Cuba. I can't say enough good things about this book. It's also very funny.
Oh, yeah. She's a great writer.
Yeah.
I would recommend this book to anyone.
Yeah. Everyone should read
And it's
this
also
book.
it's not just about her experience as a disabled person. She's pulling from so many different facets of her incredibly diverse life and incredibly full of experience.
Yeah. Another thing that could be part of our conversation today is Unspeakable Conversations, Right to Die, and Eugenics. I think we table that. I think we do another episode about Right to Die, the law that recently passed in New York. And that's where we talk about Unspeakable Conversations, because I have enjoyed the lightness of our conversation today. And also, we've been talking for a while already.
Yeah. Unspeakable Conversations, as you mentioned before, was the article that she wrote in response to her experience being invited to come and debate with Peter Singer, who was in part advocating for selective infanticide. You had mentioned that article to me and sent it to me, and I read that article.
I think I kind of said, we're in a relationship now. You must read Unspeakable Conversations. Also, you must watch Walk Hard, the Dewey Cox story, and Saw, because that's what I'm like.
All of those
as a
things,
girlfriend.
which I thoroughly enjoyed.
Great. Yeah. I've watched all of 2 episodes of One Piece, and that's a moral failing on my part.
We'll get there.
We'll get there.
And I think maybe we should take the time to think, for you and I specifically, how has this book made us think about how we love in a society?
You mean for each of us individually, or for the 2 of us as a pair?
I mean for each of us individually. Yeah. And maybe I should go first, because I probably am more representative of the general non-disabled persons who would be reading this book. The book was a very exemplary highlight of how we, as non-disabled people, overemphasize on the disabled part. And with that disabled part, they also narrow that to this certain view of a unfulfilled life. And if there's anything this book taught me, it's that everyone can live an incredibly fulfilling life as long as they have the resources that they need to pursue that life.
Yeah, and that what makes your life fulfilling won't be the same as what makes another person's life fulfilling.
Yeah.
Non-disabled people really value independence a lot of the time, but because of ableism, by which I mean the system, the cultural system that privileges non-disabled people over disabled people, right? What we think of as independence is in fact dependence on systems that our cultural norms render invisible. So you are not independent. You're not out living in the woods foraging for mushrooms and hunting deer with a spear that you sharpened yourself with, I don't know, a big rock. You're driving places in your car, or you're taking the subway or the bus. You're using electricity to cook your food that you picked up from the grocery store next door. And yet, when non-disabled people think about depending on a home health aid, depending on a mobility device, medication. All of this is perceived as a loss of independence and a fundamental loss of dignity. And I think that one thing that non-disabled people can do to act more lovingly is to stop thinking of disabled people as uniquely dependent, to stop thinking of disabled people as the exception to a rule of independence, that in fact we all need each other.
Yeah, I feel like that point that you just made about our kind of interdependence, it's not that like, oh, I'm so dependent on other people for my life. I think it's more of this view of like, we are all interdependent on one another.
Yeah, we need each other.
We need each other.
Yeah.
And if you want a brief examination of that from an economics perspective, you can look at my, as of now, recent YouTube video, People Are the Economy.
Yeah, I can't wait to watch that. And also, one of your earlier videos, when you were doing a lot of stuff about fat phobia and fat liberation and stuff, like you talked about the social model of health, that health ought to be measured by the ability of the person to live a fulfilling life, whatever that means to them. That made such a huge impression on me. You talked about it really beautifully from a lot of different angles in that series of, I think, like 3 or 4 videos that you did about fat phobia and fat liberation. Everyone should watch them. They're so much fun.
If you want more content with me talking.
I love content with you talking.
Well, you're biased.
The thing that I learned from this book that was like a really important takeaway from me, and that I think I've also been reflecting on these past 6 months, you know, seeking out, as I have been, disabled community in a way that I haven't done before, is a lot of the ideas that I have, I did not come up with. There are and have been disabled thinkers, writers, activists, athletes, artists who have come up with a lot of really similar ideas to what I have and expressed them better or differently. And that I ought to joyfully seek out those perspectives more and reflect upon and draw further attention to the giants whose shoulders I stand on. There have been times in my life where I've thought, oh, I just have such a unique perspective about disability. There can be no one who's ever thought of things this way before, because the party line is so much inspiration porny, person first, like very conventional, tug at the heartstrings worldview. But in fact, people have been critiquing that aggressively since before I was born. And I certainly won't stop my yapping, but I should be also doing a lot of reading and listening. What a joyful task that is to have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, to be in conversation with others.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I've enjoyed our conversation today, and I'm looking forward to watching silly crime mystery, Knives Out, new movie.
Me too, and I'm looking forward to watching your video essay about vibes economics.
Yeah.
I love you.
I love you too. Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Oh, Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. An entire philosophical system to, in part, scaffold his own boner's inherent wisdom about what is natural and good and beautiful.